Welcome everybody to our week 4 Consumer Cultures podcast. And this week we're going to look at consumer culture and space. And this is one of my favorite topics in KCB203 because I think it takes a different look to not only consumer culture but to media in general and asks us to consider the way in which media is embedded in our physical space, whether that be through, advertising, shop fronts, but also the way in which media is now present when we're outside through our mobile devices, but also through large television screens and the kind of presence of the kind of omnipresence, if you like, of media. So when we talk about consumer culture and space, we're looking at a shift in capitalism in Western society in particular, but I think also generally across the globe, particularly in Asian countries and developed Asian countries in particular, where we see a key feature of consumer culture being the increasing use of space dedicated to consumption and leisure experiences. So we have shopping malls, but we also have things like theme parks and places like parks and kind of public spaces which are designed not only to be consumed in and of themselves, but also have consumption spaces within them. So, we will go to the park and there will be a cafe there, or you'll be able to buy ice creams or something like that. And as a result, we increasingly use space to produce, consume, and build relationships and maintain our identity. So we consume space in the same way that we consume anything else within consumer culture, and how we orient ourselves to space at any particular time becomes a way of establishing and maintaining our identity. And we'll have a look at that when we consider some of the ways we might behave in a whole range of public spaces. And this shift from a production to consumption-based economy has transformed Western cities and the nature of everyday life. It's now almost impossible, and we've touched on this before in earlier podcasts, but it's now almost impossible to think of the urban experience in particular as being somehow separate from consumer culture. So there's this intimate link between urban life in particular and consumer culture. And of course, mobile technologies facilitate the blurring of personal and public space. And again, we'll have a look at the ways in which mobile technologies change the way we behave in public spaces, and the kind of shift of personal behaviors, personal activities into public spaces. But one of the most dramatic examples for us, those of us who live in Brisbane and are familiar with the history of Brisbane, I think, in terms of understanding that transition from of public space from production to consumption, can be seen in South Bank. So the South Bank parklands across the river from Gardens Point. It might indeed be a road if some of the developers of Queen's Wharf have their way. But anyway, so across the river from Gardens Point, and we know, well, most of you at least know South Bank as kind of parklands, a place where you can go and sit, but also go to cafes, restaurants, shops. It's also got what I still think to this very day is kind of bizarre for a city like Brisbane, which is so close to fantastic beaches. It's got an artificial beach in the city. So South Bank, as we know it today, is very much a space of consumption. And its history, the history of South Bank, or the more recent history at least, really demonstrates its shift from a place of production primarily to a place of consumption. And that was most dramatically seen in the development of the South Bank area as the main site for Expo 88. So the World's Fair in 1988 was held in Brisbane, and that was a phenomenally important transition for the city in terms of how we consumed public space. So first and foremost, you had the creation of the South Bank Expo site, which up until then had kind of been disused industrial land, and we'll have a look at a photo of what South Bank used to be in a minute. So we had this transition of kind of wasteland in many ways into a consumption zone. But Expo also produced really interesting shifts in how we engage in public space. People are still amazed when I tell them that you were not able to eat outside at a cafe or restaurant, dine al fresco in Brisbane until 1988 because of a whole range of very bizarre laws put in place by the Bjelke-Petersen government. Al fresco dining in Brisbane was actually illegal until Expo 88 came along. So that was an enormous shift. It was also an enormous shift because it provided a place for people who lived in Brisbane to go out on a weeknight, which again, apart from late night shopping, was kind of unheard of. And you have to remember, again, this will blow some of your minds, that at this time, shops were not open all day Saturday, and certainly the vast majority of them were also closed on Sunday. So shops in Brisbane at the time of Expo, so the 80s, late night shopping was Thursday night, and then shops on the weekend were open from about 8:30 till 12, and that was it. So Expo 88 actually provided people with a great range of entertainment options during the week. And it wasn't so long after that Brisbane, or Queensland rather, experimented and trialled daylight savings. So a couple of years later, we had a daylight savings trial, which was unsuccessful. So don't underestimate the significance of Expo 88 in Brisbane's cultural history. Of course, it wasn't so many. It was around about the time of Expo 88 also that the Bjelke-Petersen government fell. So a few years later again, the Bjelke-Petersen government fell. So Expo 88 was kind of like a transition point in Brisbane's cultural identity. But it wasn't always like that. So South Bank originally was a place of production. It was a shipyard and also wharves. So container ships cargo ships would dock here, ships would be repaired, and it was a space in the early days of Brisbane of very much of production. It was an industrial area. It was a very heavily working class area, which is quite different to what it is now. So we see, as we see a shift in spaces from production to consumption oriented zones, we'll also see a change in the socioeconomic makeup of the population as gentrification takes hold. And South Bank was once a very different place. And I think the South Bank site operates as a really interesting metaphor for that kind of shift from production to consumption that we see in so many urban environments right across the world. But I think South Bank's a really good one and an interesting one because it's part of where we live, and we've all been there. Now, physical spaces encourage us to behave in particular ways. So physical spaces produce social norms and socially accepted standards of behavior. So when we are in a particular physical environment, we know through convention that we need to behave in particular ways. So if you're queuing up for a quite delicious but nonetheless overpriced donut at donut time, you will be patient. You will try and look as cool as possible. You will, Instagram your donut. You won't sort of push in front of people and try and climb the counter to get your sugar fix. So physical spaces govern the way we behave, and that has an important role to play in how we consume space. So we might use space, or we might consume space in a way that marks out our territory. So territoriality. So here we have some gang members occupying a public street, a street corner, and they've kind of claimed that space as their own, both through the graffiti on the wall, but also through their kind of intimidating appearance. So, if you saw these three guys coming towards you, it's fair to say, particularly if it was at night, that you might be inclined to kind of move to the other side of the street, or sort of walk with your head down. So subcultures in particular will attempt or make attempts as a symbolic form of resistance to occupy public spaces in ways that attempt to claim them as their own. And you can see people do that, an enormous range of subcultures and various kind of groups of people, all the way through to goths, through to business people, doing that in the kind of Queen Street Mall area outside Hungry Jack's, which is a bit of a Brisbane landmark. And people still say, when you're going to meet someone in town, where will you meet you? Where will I meet you? Outside Hungry Jack's. And it's interesting that part of the mall is kind of the crossroads. I think there are like 4 or 5 different paths to that section of the mall. So it's kind of like physically a meeting space, and a whole range of cultural groups kind of occupy it in a way that makes it theirs. And of course, that space is also heavily policed. There's always kind of a police patrol there to sort of maintain public order. So we will use space to carve out territoriality as kind of a form of symbolic resistance. When, we accept the idea of crowding and being overcrowded as kind of an inevitable part of the shopping experience in particular. So there's this great irony, particularly at sale times, of kind of these nice, glamorous shopping malls which are kind of designed in many ways to be pristine and clean and get you in and out as quickly as possible. There's kind of a disjunction between that and the massive overcrowding that takes place in sales periods. So here, you know, if we look at this photo and you're a person caught up in one of these sales, you're probably less likely to be browsing. You're kind of being pushed along by the kind of sea of humanity that exists there. Now, one of the things that I think social media has done in particular in terms of the way we relate to public space is that it's pushed a whole lot of behaviours that were once upon a time seen as private into the public domain. And I'm not necessarily talking about public displays of affection, which have been going on for since forever, but I am talking about things like, you know, having conversations on your mobile phone in a way where at least half the conversation can be heard by those people around you. I think wearing headphones is another example of the way in which our personalized media has become a form of public display. So we'll use headphones to kind of shut ourselves off from what's going on around us, or provide kind of a soundtrack to the environment in which we're in. And I love the fellow to this couple's left, who's very clearly taking a photo of them having a pash, and that type of behaviour as well, where we'll not only engage in kind of private behaviours publicly, but we'll capture them as well. You know, we'll capture them on our phone. So our relationship, thanks to mobile media, our relationship between the public and the private spheres, or the public and the private domains, has become very, very blurred. Different cultures have different conceptions of personal space and what is an accepted or acceptable level of personal space. And you know, it lies somewhere between the extremes of what we're seeing in this photo, all the way through to kind of Western middle class perceptions of personal space, which you know, really work to maintain and privilege the individual. So the idea of, you know, keeping people at arm's length, both metaphorically and physically, is very much kind of a bourgeois Western cultural tradition that just doesn't exist in other cultures. And of course, we can talk about physical barriers, regulations, and laws governing the ways in which we operate in public space, or what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do in public space. And I think one of the most dramatic demonstrations of that, again, across the world, but in Australia in particular, Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne, with the lockout laws for bars and nightclubs, and the controversy and the demonstrations around those laws, I think, are a really good example of the ways in which our relationship to public space is governed by authorities, or attempted at least to be governed by authorities. So to reiterate a point that I made at the start of this podcast, consumer culture has fundamentally transformed how we operate in the spaces that we live in. And urbanisation produces spaces which have been specifically designed for specific types of consumption and social interaction and displays of identity. So the urban environment gives us kind of licensed spaces for consuming and behaving in particular ways. And that again is the result of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution resulted in designated zones for production and consumption and introduced the needs for public transportation in order to facilitate that shift from production to consumption zones. And of course, different geographical zones also work to separate people from specific social classes. So here we have a painting of Central Park in New York, which was designed as a place for the middle and upper classes to stroll, to promenade, to be seen, and to be seen engaging in leisure, to engage in displays of conspicuous consumption, so your clothing, and the idea that you had leisure time, you had the time to be able to indulge in a Sunday afternoon stroll, marked you as belonging to a particular social class, which stands in stark contrast to these spaces, urban spaces from industrial England, where people lived and worked in the same places, and until it was discovered that, breathing in the smog from the factories where you worked was 24 hours a day was not particularly good for your health. So as a result of that, we saw the flight to the suburbs. And of course, we can see in urban spaces the distinction between wealth and poverty, and I think there's no better example of that than Rio de Janeiro, where you can literally see the poverty line. If you look at photos of the city, you can literally see the poverty line, where the kind of glitz and glamour of the beaches give way to the poverty and the crime of the favelas. Now, cities, and particular cities, can become extremely complex sites of consumption. So if we take, for example, a city like New York, which is not only made up of spaces of consumption, so tourist attractions and shops, but the city itself is a space to be consumed. So we can just hop on a bus and consume New York City on a tour. So it's kind of a site of consumption made up of smaller sites of consumption. And of course, we don't need to live in the city in order to consume it. And that again is represented, I think, quite nicely in the opening sequence of Sex and the City, where the city and the makers of Sex and the City have described New York in this way in the show as kind of being another character. So the city, when we watch the opening sequence, is introduced to us as another character. It is a place that has an impact on Carrie in the opening sequence. And again, you can have a look at this clip of Taylor Swift performing her song "Welcome to New York" in New York on New Year's Eve in Times Square. So this is a song about New York being performed in an iconic New York location for an iconic New York event, which is both physically experienced by people in the city, but also broadcast to the rest of the world. So cities, New York, London, Paris, operate as very, the Gold Coast fits into this as well, I think. Operate as very complex sites of consumption. So back in week 2, Georg Simmel argued that as spaces become geared towards consumption, our social interactions become more superficial and depersonalized, which is ironic in many ways because urbanization puts more people into spaces, and yet our interactions, despite there being more people, or perhaps because there are more people, are in fact more superficial and depersonalized than they once were. So the privatization of public space also constructs ritualized relationships that control diversity. So different areas in Brisbane will encourage us to behave in particular ways. So we might behave a particular way in the valley that we would not behave in the same way at Westfield Chermside, say, or at our kind of local shops. Spaces are increasingly designed to facilitate economic transactions, not social relationships. So if we think of the growth of self-service checkouts, drive-through cafes, spaces which are designed to facilitate economic transactions and consumptions, not social relationships. And certainly in my tutorial groups, we've had interesting discussions about the awkwardness, those people in the classes who work retail, the awkwardness of the kind of discussions and transactions that you have with your customers. So kind of like very awkward, very superficial, kind of meaningless in so many ways. We've also seen as the idea of the main street or the high street as a zone of not only commerce but community, as we've seen that idea of the main street kind of disappear in everyday life, it's emerged as a consumer fantasy and kind of a marker of authenticity. So Marx would have a field day with all of these versions of the main street, which are all tourist spaces. So top left-hand corner, we've got Disney World. The bottom left-hand corner, we've got Montville up in the Sunshine Coast hinterland, which is kind of this quaint little main street in a country town, which is all shops and cafes, all tourist attractions. And my favorite here, in the top right, this kind of main street, which is on a cruise ship, which I just think is amazing. So here you've got a replica main street kind of shopping village at sea. So Marx would have a field day with these kind of places as kind of sites of alienation, reproductions, which offer an illusion of authenticity, but are simply nothing more than kind of places to spend money, to places that operate to take our money from us. Of course, we've also seen, particularly in Australia, the major capital cities, all of them, not just on the East Coast, but Adelaide and Perth as well, the growth of laneway culture again, as kind of another mark of authenticity. So you can look at, you could look at laneway culture in two ways. You could look at it as kind of the democratization of public space, so allowing small independent coffee shops, restaurants, boutiques, kind of indie alternative places to do business. Or more cynically, you could look at the growth of laneway culture as kind of attempting to shove as many shops as possible into really tight spaces to once again kind of get people to kind of separate people from their money. But the growth of laneway culture, I think, is a fascinating way in which public spaces in Brisbane in particular have been transformed. One thing that consumption and geography has always been linked to is the idea of establishing an identity or allowing yourself to create an identity through a sense of place. So you have a favorite shop, you have a favorite cafe, you have a favorite restaurant, where the people who work there might know your name, they might know your favorite coffee. It might, if you're a really, really super regular customer, it might be waiting for you when you get there. So we have a very intimate relationship with sites of consumption that allow us to feel embedded in that place. And as capitalism becomes more efficient, consumer transactions become increasingly more anonymous. So we're desperately, in many ways, and I think this does in Australia certainly, I think it explains the popularity of independent cafes. Independent cafes in Australia are flourishing compared to other countries. And I think it's partly at least because of the social relationships and the sense of identity that we can establish and maintain through our interactions with those spaces. And Anthony Giddens, the sociologist, talks about this concept of disembeddedness, or the transfer of social relationships from a local context to indeterminate times and spaces. So again, online shopping is a really good example of that. And if you want to see, a really funny, but I think also very poignant example of how we use, or how we once used, consumer spaces to maintain an identity. Have a look at this clip from the movie High Fidelity, which features Jack Black and John Cusack. The name of the name of this clip from YouTube is Saturday Morning at the Record Store. So if you haven't seen the film, this is, I think, a really powerful example of how important coming to a place to buy records, buy clothes, to buy things which we use to construct an identity, how important that is to us. So much so that, Jack Black will abuse you and call you all sorts of names as part of your initiation into a particular subculture, or your initiation into acquiring a particular form of cultural capital. And I think it's really poignant because record shops don't exist that much anymore. We stream, we buy online, we illegally download. So this kind of use of the record store in particular, you could make a similar argument about bookstores. I think is it makes me feel nostalgic in many ways, because you can't any longer really sort of go and hang out at a record store. There's a few left in Brisbane, and just sort of browse and pick up things of interest. So have a look at that clip, and I think that demonstrates our relationship between sites of consumption and our sense of identity, our sense of place, really nicely. You know, looking at our recommendations on Amazon or Spotify, which have been algorithmically produced for us, they just don't have the same impact, do they? It's just not as much fun. As the physical spaces in which we consume become increasingly homogenized, we can make a distinction between heterogeneous consumption spaces like our market on the left and purified consumption spaces such as the supermarket. So you can get exactly the same produce in both spaces, but the experience you will have is quite different. So going to the market on the left will be, at least to a Westerner, or at least to someone who is new to that environment, will be quite chaotic. Whereas going to Coles, for most of us, will be a very orderly, bland, and mundane experience. So this increasing kind of homogenization of our consumption zones, our spaces of consumption, has given rise to what sociologists call the non-place. So generic, highly contrived and controlled spaces, which are not embedded in local geography or culture. I mean, they exist in physical places, but they have no distinctive markings of national or local identity in any way, shape, or form. They exist simply to encourage individualized consumption. So non-places, or examples of non-places, we can see here. The duty-free zone in international airports is kind of a classic non-space. You know, that area that you walk between, going through the airport security and then getting to your departure gate. You're bombarded and your senses are assaulted by lights, people trying to flog you, various, duty-free products. But if it wasn't for those shops, that space would be bare, that space would be empty. It is completely, a non-space that has been occupied by consumption. Another really good example of the non-place is the generic traditional English pub, which you can find in basically any shopping centre and sort of, around the place. So the Pig and Whistle, Gilhooly's, all those sorts of places, kind of replicas of what a traditional English or Irish pub's supposed to look like, but completely homogenous. A Pig and Whistle at Garden City looks exactly the same as a Pig and Whistle in town, looks exactly the same as a Pig and Whistle at Chermside. They're kind of generic, bland places that reproduce an imagined authenticity. And Apple and McDonald's stores, again, are really good examples of the non-place. They proliferate. They're increasingly everywhere, but they have no identity other than their brand. They have no personality outside the brand personality. And the companies don't want them to have any identity outside of that quite fixed and controlled brand. A humorous take on the non-place is provided in this clip from The Simpsons, which you can access if you follow the link in the title, which talks about Starbucks as a non-place and the way in which Starbucks kind of proliferates and eats up other spaces which have more personality and more identity. Of course, the ultimate non-place is Las Vegas, a place which has, or a place which is so lacking in any authentic identity that is, in fact, its identity. So the fact that it is inauthentic, the fact that it is a replica on one hand and a zone of hedonistic consumption on the other serves to define its identity. So, you know, Las Vegas is the home to one of the most gratuitous forms of consumption, gambling. So, you know, willingly giving up our hard-earned money to slot machines or roulette wheels, a system that's stacked against us, a system that's completely stacked against us. And on the other hand, you know, Las Vegas is a place made up of replicas. There's a replica pyramid. There are replica gondolas. There are replica Eiffel Towers. There are replica statues of liberty, all in amongst shopping malls. So it's a city that's identity is based on the fact that it has no identity of its own. But despite these rhetorics and ideologies of consumer sovereignty and freedom of choice, a lot of our consumer space is in fact highly regulated. Now, it's about the regulation of desire, not necessarily the suppression of freedom, although that does play a role. And we can see this played out in two strategies. First of all, there are spaces which are dedicated to the stimulation of desire through the creation of fantasy worlds. So theme parks are an obvious example of these spaces which exist as a fantasy world, and they are called worlds: dream world, movie world, and they exist to stimulate our desire. The other strategy is to eliminate behaviors in public space that do not encourage spending. So if we consider for a moment shopping centers are in fact highly regulated spaces. There are certain things that you can and can't do. Window shopping is tolerated, but skateboarding, using the space for your own leisure purposes that are not provided by the shopping center management, that's not encouraged. Using a shopping mall or a shop to live in is absolutely unacceptable. So, you know, the clashes between authorities and homeless people who will use shop fronts as places to live. So your shopping centers, whether it be a Westfield shopping mall or your local shops, are in fact highly regulated places. To wrap up, what I wanted to stress in this podcast is the idea that space has become increasingly commodified in order to encourage increasingly seamless and frictionless economic transactions. All the personality is increasingly removed from where we consume in order to make that consumption practice increasingly seamless. I guess the most dramatic example and the most obvious example of that is the rise of the automatic checkout, so the self-serve checkout. And the great irony here is that these spaces work to bring people together physically, public spaces of consumption, work to bring people together physically, but then isolate them socially, simultaneously. And finally, identity is increasingly less connected to space, to geography and location than it is to kind of loose social affiliations. So consumer culture in so many ways kind of destroys a sense of identity based on community, based on geographical location. It kind of breaks that down and then rebuilds our identity through loose social affiliations. Hence, you can have Manchester United fan clubs across the world, because Manchester United is not just a football team that's based in Manchester in the UK. It's a brand. It's a form of merchandise. It's a form of programming. On TV, you can watch the games. And similarly, this kind of separation of identity and geography and the replacing of that with identity based around loose cultural and social affiliations explains why the NBA, the National Basketball, the NBL, the National Basketball League from America, can be enormously popular in China. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this podcast as much as I did, and I hope it's changed the way in which you think about your own relationship to space as a consumer. So the next time you go shopping, the next time you go to a restaurant, cafe, go or hang out somewhere, I want you to think about the ways in which people are consuming that space, and then think about your own consumption of that space and reflect upon that. How is the space regulating the ways in which you behave? How do you attempt to resist that? What behaviors, what practices do you engage in that might kind of tweak the intended use of that space as kind of a form of resistance? And we'll get you to reflect on those in the review activities for this week, and we will talk about them. We'll talk about that in tutorials. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you in class.